The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body.
Medicine taught us to, there's a problem and you give them a pill or you do something and they go away and that's it. And the longer you stay in one place and you get to know people, you realize that, there must be something more than that because, what they do day to day obviously must make a difference to how well they are functioning.
And I want to thank everyone who has been listening and taken time to tune in to this first season of the podcast. I really appreciate you taking time to provide me with some very valuable and constructive feedback and for bearing with me. This is very much a learning journey for me still. And I think I said in the very first episode that it had taken me several years to actually bring myself beyond the pre-contemplation stage and put this passion project into action. I have a mentor who I have to mention who has two fantastic podcasts. I probably have mentioned him before. So Dr Andrew Davies, who's an intensivist in Melbourne, Australia. And I have long tuned into both of his podcasts. So he has a medically based podcast about his own specialty, mastering intensive care. And he also has a lifestyle medicine podcast called The New Normal Project. And the best advice that I have received came from Andrew way back in March last year. He said, do this as if you don't care who's listening, do it for you. So thank you, Andrew. And I think the other piece of advice I was given is don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. And I know certainly at least one of my colleagues has moved beyond the pre-contemplation stage through this period. And I hope that I've been of some use to her. I did have a listen. I can't give away too much. This is a teaser, but I did have a listen to some of her inaugural footage, and I have to say it's 100 times better than anything I have been able to produce. So I'm really excited to listen and tune in and share her project when it goes live. So that's all I'm going to say for now. So I suspect in the podcasting world there's some etiquette around recording and producing your wrap-up end of the year episode. And that probably entails that it should be recorded and go live at the end of the year. Yet here we are, quite a few weeks into January, and I'm finally getting round to recording this episode. Apologies. In my defence, I was working through the Christmas New Year period, and shout out to all my emergency colleagues and all the emergency services for whom it's very much business as usual, if not busier at this time of year. I know that unanimously we're glad to see the back of 2020, but I'm also very conscious that 2021 hasn't magically changed the situation. We are still facing a global pandemic, and for many people around the world, things are just as, if not much more challenging. As you know, I have friends and family overseas, and they're not here where I'm recording in Australia. And it's just that my family are in lockdown, and that many of my colleagues overseas are really probably facing some of the most challenging times in their career. So I'm sending love and strength to them right now. It's been great, despite of all those challenges, that they are still keeping good humour, and thank you for all the funny memes that have recirculated in the second lockdown. They're certainly keeping me smiling. And it's great to see pictures of them receiving vaccinations, and I really think we have to maintain our hope and optimism.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we now have a mandate with COVID to design our emergency departments as they should be, to be as efficient for patients as possible, to be as safe for both staff and patients as possible. These were problems before COVID, but COVID has accentuated all the problems we have.
So I wanted this episode to just be a bit of a recap of this first season and some of the highlights for me, and there have been many. I spent the past week and a half listening back to every episode and cringing at my audio bloopers, but also beaming at the amazing content provided by my guests. I can't thank them enough. I've said many times, these are people that have really and continue to shine and influence me in my life, and I think they have some really important expertise and perspective, and there's so much gold, so many pearls, and I wanted to share a few of them today.
And I think that one of the most empowering things that we can do right now is to use whatever skills we have to contribute in a positive way, because that's going to give us a sense of control and a sense of meaning. And
I've said before that my guests through this first season are people that I consider and regard as game changers. They are very much enthusiasts. They walk the walk, and they aren't afraid to take risks. They aren't afraid to change something or to reconsider their stance or view and to widen that. And I think that's been pretty apparent.
So many people who are affecting change, and I think that just gave me the permission to do things differently. And to be around another amazing group of people who were thinking the same way I was, that, there's a lot of great things that modern medicine has been able to do, but there's some very embedded systemic things that are preventing flow and that are holding us back. And there are better ways to do it.
Again, I've always been somebody who is, I think you've got to walk the walk to talk the talk. And I think my leadership style, I suppose, has always been about walking the walk. And I've never been, even when I was director, acting director at my hospital, I was always doing, on the floor doing 2 or 3 clinical shifts a week. because I just don't think you can bring people along for the ride unless you're actually on the ride yourself.
I just wanted to give a shout out to Joe Smith, who is a recruitment consultant for emergency physicians at one of the locum agencies here in Australia, and actually they have offices around the world, Blugibbon. And he had reached out to me after a colleague in the department had been listening to the podcast, and he thought it was really, there was some material and content worth sharing with their doctors. One of their team, Terry Cornick, has a number of wonderful initiatives, particularly involving men's mental health and initiatives through sport. The Mr. Perfect project. So I'm going to give you a couple of links to those because they really are fantastic. And as an organisation, they have been supporting things like the Creative Careers in Medicine conference, which I may have mentioned here on the podcast, and Code of Change, which they'll be supporting when it comes up. I think I mentioned in the last episode. So it's really, very nice to see them supporting projects like this. And I was obviously only too delighted to talk about the podcast and, potentially bring it to a wider audience. But you can imagine my delight when I found out when Joe called me that he was actually Scottish. So you can imagine the many rabbit holes that we both went down with that knowledge. He kept that a secret from me. Cheeky. But I want to thank Joe because that conversation, I think it reminded me of my why for starting this in the first place. And I want to thank him for that. It also reminded me of, the very beginning of my medical career here in Australia and the kind of stuttering start that I had, and how important a locum agency like Blugibbon at that point really was in retrospect. I had gone on the internet to try and find a job. I was determined. I was coming. It was a couple of years after I qualified, and unfortunately, I didn't really. So I didn't apply for the right visa, and I didn't really think about all the other factors like where I would live and how I would commute and exactly where I would be working. And I think I found within 48 hours that I'd probably bitten off more than I could chew. And I remember my mum saying to me, just come home. And I was like, no, I'm not doing that. No, I've come here. And I remember going back to Sydney and sitting on a bench at Circular Quay, still one of, my favourite tourist place to be. And I was on the internet again and I looked up the BMJ Careers website and I found Ron from Quantum Recruitment. Thank you, Ron. You maybe don't realise the impact you had on my career and life. But he said, look, Cheryl, you have friends and family in Melbourne. Get on a plane. Send me your CV. So within 24 hours, he'd got me 4 interviews. He told me to go for a particular one, and I did. And then a dear friend, Dr Chang, who had studied with me in Glasgow, also met me the very same day and said, just come and live with me. So I really want to thank both of them. But the other interesting thing was I was on the wrong visa. So in my lack of guidance, had I actually entrusted all of these finer details and very important details to an agency much sooner, I wouldn't have found myself waiting for 3 weeks to get onto the right medical practitioner visa. So there's you live and learn. And the other interesting thing is that the head of Blugibbon is Sam Whitaker, who I have previously met when he worked for a different locum agency, when I was a junior consultant and looking to have a bit of a different experience as a new FACEM. Thanks to Sam, I got to work in the Blue Mountains and Alice Springs, and, experience a different work environment and also explore some fabulous local trails. So thank you, Sam. And it's just, it's really heartening to see a company not only support doctors in their professional endeavours and encourage them to think out of the box when they apply for jobs, but also to support their their mental, their emotional, their social well-being. And yeah, I was very impressed. So keep up the great work. I think that, what you're doing very much resonates with many of the topics that we visited in this podcast. And you know that I am very passionate about the systems and support that we have for our healthcare professionals, because what they do really matters. It affects the quality of care they're able to give, so it does influence their patient care. I think they're doing a marvellous job, and I want them to keep doing that for all of their careers. So thanks again. And I think on that subject of your why, it's been really interesting to see that many of my guests have actually come back after a conversation, after the recording, and said that, that thanked me for being involved because it has reaffirmed their own why and really kept them motivated. Some of them have felt re-inspired and reinvigorated to continue on their own journey. So that's been really gratifying to hear, because I hope they keep going, because they're certainly inspiring me, and I know many of you too. So a couple of fun facts. It's the nerdy cool thing about being a podcaster is that you are privy to the data about who is listening, where they're listening from, and how they're listening. And some of the stats for the podcast, so we're listened to in 38 countries. And the top 5 are probably fairly predictable. Shout out to Australia, so where I'm recording from. So most of the audience are listening from Australia. That's followed by the UK, and then America, New Zealand, and Canada. So that's the top 5. But then it's really, it's fascinating to see where else we have a couple of listeners. So places like Chile and Myanmar, Costa Rica, Kenya, Egypt, Zambia, Luxembourg. So love to hear from you, or if you are tuning into one of those countries. And, again, probably fairly predictable. Most people are listening via Apple Podcasts. So that's 55%. Some are listening on Spotify or Amazon. I think we're on most of the major platforms now. Very few people actually tune in from the actual Buzzsprout site itself. And 88% of you are listening on a mobile, and of that, 3/4 of you are actually on an Apple iPhone, which is interesting. So that's the data. Be interesting to see how that changes. I will give you an update at the next end of season episode. Thank you again for listening. So books have been pretty important through this first season. As you know, that many of my guests are authors themselves. Most of them are also bookworms, and if they haven't yet written a book, like Cliff, then they have certainly helped supplement my book list. And I'm hopeful that we'll have in season 2. I've got some good books to read in advance of interviewing some upcoming guests, and I'm really excited about that. Now, I was gifted, so talking about Joe, after our conversation, he very kindly gifted me a book. And it's 100 stories to say thank you to the NHS. So this was edited by another of my favourite authors, Adam Kay. And if you haven't read This Is Going to Hurt or 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, please read it or read them. They are fantastic. And I think that, Adam, although he's a comedian, he was a very senior obstetrician, and really his own story is powerful. And his experiences, I mean, much of that resonates with me. He graduated I think the year after me, and did his, initial training, all of his training in the NHS, but that initial training I had was very much similar. And this, so the aim of this 100 Stories, Dear NHS, is that all the profits are going to the NHS charities together and the Lullaby Trust. And you'll recognise many of the celebrities that have contributed. So we've got Paul McCartney, Sir Trevor McDonald, Emma Thompson, Jill Brand, Louis Theroux, Graham Norton, the list goes on. And it's actually, I've just started it, and Emma Thompson, I've just read her chapter. And she talks about an experience in an emergency department. And I think her daughter had needed some stitches after a fall to her head, and it was in the middle of the night or early morning. And I think the young doctor had she was stable and okay, she just needed a couple of stitches, and had excused himself just to eat something because he was pretty hungry and very tired. And I think there had been somebody else in who was a carer for another patient, his mother, and I think they would have preferred that he would stay in overnight, but, he couldn't because there would be nobody to look after his mother. And that's a situation, I see very commonly. And Emma, having witnessed that, she said, we offered to help, but there was nothing we could do. He just needed to get treatment and get back to her as soon as he could. There would certainly be no one but the NHS to look after him. You've heard of the untouchables. You've heard of the expendables. That doctor, that hurt carer belong to the indispensables. Right now, there is no exaggeration to say that they are the only ones standing between us and complete calamity. Who else, doing what job and in what capacity, can make that claim? 4 weeks into lockdown, I've listened daily to the stories of heroism and sacrifice and unimaginable loss that occur every moment of every day and every night within the NHS and in its hospices and care homes and ordinary homes. I marvel at the courage, I weep for the losses, and I know that after this, we will never be the same again. At least I hope we won't. I hope we will realise what is important, not profit, but people. I hope that every priority we have had to accept as normal changes, and that we find our way towards society that cares first and foremost about its indispensable workers.
I think what Tan is really speaking to there is that we need to, it's no good just looking at individual services or individual programs and things. It's a system-wide approach that we need. And, we talked a bit about barriers earlier, and the barriers to doctors seeking help and other healthcare practitioners seeking help are those within us, the stigma, the shame that we feel, our reluctance and the difficulty in becoming a care receiver instead of a caregiver. So we do need to start in medical school about the importance of looking after yourself and as well as looking after others, and that strong message about self-compassion, that mindfulness that you can't actually do your job properly if you're not in good shape mentally and physically yourself, and carry that message all the way through.
So I had a self-care Sunday today. I went for a beautiful trail run on some stunning coastal trails. If you know the Kingston Beach area in Hobart, so the Alum Cliffs, if you're down that way, that is definitely a walk, hike, run worth checking out. And I was listening to a podcast, one of my favourite podcasts, Dr Rangan Chatterjee's. He's a lifestyle medicine physician based in the UK. He's somebody else who's definitely inspired my podcasting journey. And he was interviewing an author called James Clear, who's written a book called Atomic Habits, which I haven't yet read. I've now downloaded it on Audible. But they were talking about the art and science of behavior change. We kind of are probably all familiar with this idea of that we are the sum of our habits, and what we do every day matters. And a lot of his book is about how we tweak and set up the stage to make it easier to attain the goals that we have for ourselves. In yoga, we have this idea of samskaras, which are those habits that we have, and they can be good and bad. And James is, when you look up his book or look online, that there's he's oft quoted to say that you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And he's very much talking about us as individuals there, and that really, we sometimes, in order to achieve our goals, we have to have the system in place, and the collection of daily habits that we have is effectively our system. So I'm looking forward to reading that book. But it did get me thinking. That quote kind of stood out for me because, I think the same could be said for, much of what we've touched on through this podcast on, my medical professional culture. And I talk a lot about, the need to support ourselves, but really, it's all about changing the culture, changing the system, addressing the deep systemic issues that we have. We can have goals individually for our own well-being, our health and our self-care, but if our system doesn't support that, then we fall to the level of that, and we see this time and time again in many areas of work and professional life. I think if you are familiar with the themes of this podcast, that really does kind of hit at the heart of it. So I'm looking forward to reading that, and I'll put that one on the book list too.
Although I've sort of talked about creativity and music as a way to prioritize joy and sustain my own well-being, like I've really thought about like what would have happened if I'd had that approach to my training. Like, would it have made a difference? But I think wholeheartedly, I'd have to say that you have to have your basic needs met first, that you have to be well slept and well watered and fed and have just the absolute basics before creativity can sprinkle on and do what.
So this idea of an all-encompassing view of health, I said again at the beginning, modern medicine is amazing and many of the things we can do today are incredible, but we don't have all the answers. And this idea of medicine as an art and a science, the spectrum between ancient wisdom and modern medicine, and also tailoring care holistically to individuals and empowering people to take control of the things they can control in terms of their own health. And so these basic fundamental pillars, again, we revisit this again and again.
Whoever I talked to, whether it was professors in sleep or clinicians or academics or the general public or colleagues and friends, everybody just took sleep for granted. It wasn't a performance criteria. The fact that it was important to us was a bit irrelevant because we just ignored it. And I just found that whole thing sort of a bit fascinating. So I don't know whether I was inspired.
I think people look at load and go, well, how often am I doing stuff and how much am I doing? But there's so much more involved than that. It's sleep, it's nutrition, it's our mental state, stress, what else, like how we feel about ourselves. There's so much there that encompasses load.
And my job in my clinic is not really like that at all. It's about keeping people active, keeping people healthy physically, mentally, and it's just about, I know that again, holistic health is a cliche term, but it's more about that.
And I think, this idea of what is good health, what does it mean to you, what is well-being, what is self-care, that's something that we've revisited each episode, and certainly at the end of each episode when I've actually directed questions to each of our guests, the answers are, very, very similar. There's common themes, common threads, almost unanimously, the things that take them out of themselves and make them feel good, the ability to move their bodies, preferably outdoors in nature, to eat good, nutritious food, and to connect with the people they love, so friends and family. This idea of community connection, basic pillars of health, movement, food, sunlight, the kind of not rocket science. But it's also making space for those things. And also the idea that, life is very busy, and these are very busy people who have achieved a lot. And I think that for them, rest sometimes can be an active process, and sometimes for them, change is as good as rest. And when something isn't working, having the courage to change it is something that I've seen quite commonly, again and again. And this idea, if you have a goal that you're working towards, we talk about peaking, embracing the suck, the balance of stress and rest. I think Kelly's very articulate on this. We talk about balance, but the reality is when you're striving for something, there is no balance. But that has to be measured further down the track, with a change of pace, a change of scene. And Dominique is very articulate on this. She defines good health as the ability to be resilient, to weather the storm, because that, self-regulation and ability to toggle in challenge and bounce back is a testament to our physical or mental or emotional fitness.
We talk about balance, and for me, balance was being able to do a bit of everything, because that filled my cup in different areas,
So too little pressure, we don't perform well, we're in the zone of disengagement. Too much pressure, we're in the zone of frazzle, and our performance deteriorates. But just with the right sweet spot of optimal pressure, we're in the zone of high performance flow, when we are cognitively at our best.
You've just got to make a decision, and whatever decision you make is going to be right. There are no wrong ones, because we'll either win or we'll learn, I guess. So having the courage to actually decide instead of letting life decide for me was a really big step. And once I decided, then things became, there were still challenges, but things became a lot easier because I knew where I was going.
So the title of the podcast has been a bit controversial. So 2 words, 2 L's, mindful, not a spelling mistake. So mindful, 1 word, 1 L. This idea of paying attention on purpose in the present moment without judgment. It's such an important concept and training, and it was really great to talk with Dr. Zoon Vol about his own mindfulness teaching and practice with his adolescent patients, but also with his colleagues over in Canada. And essentially, I think in the title, I'm trying to make a lot of this accessible, because I think for most of us, certainly for me, I think we tend to, I'm certainly my own worst critic. My mind is busy. I find it difficult to switch it off. And, I have a regular yoga practice. I do try to, have a meditation practice. But, sometimes that's just watching my thoughts as they fly about the room. And you know what? That's fine. That is still a practice. Again, Dominique is very articulate on this. That's why it's called a practice. It's not called a perfect.
Yeah. If I was successful beyond my wildest dreams, we would have mindfulness embedded into everything that we do at my workplace, number one. So at my hospital and at my university, we would just have a mindful culture, and that everything in the hospital is infused with mindfulness. So all the staff, and then we would offer it to patients and to children and families in creative ways, in different units, different settings, depending on what their needs are.
So it's probably too much chat from me in this episode. I really want to thank you again to everyone who supported this first season. I have a new condenser and a boom arm, and I'm just waiting on a desk because I have finally relocated to somewhere that has a bit more room. I didn't have a lot of space in my last place of residence. So hopefully that will mean that there'll be much more and some better audio quality coming your way. But I think more importantly for me is that we keep bringing some great content. I certainly have quite a few very exciting guests lined up. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back in a month or so. But I would love to hear from you. If anything you have enjoyed, particularly would like to hear more of, anything that you would like to see visited as a topic, please reach out. And I am going to try and develop the website. It would be good to have somebody to help me do that, but I am going to carve out some space to produce a written summary. I did visit the idea of transcripts, and I had a free trial of a company doing a transcript, but unfortunately I think they struggled a little bit with my Scozzy accent. So I might have to rethink that one. But we'll also have a book list, which I would like to see grow. Essentially, I want to grow a community here. I think that's quite important to me. So thank you again. So I look forward to joining you for season 2. And I just want to leave you with Dr. Cliff Reid.
It's being able to be in the moment with stuff like that and really appreciate it, to be undistracted. That's an example of good health. Because when you're not healthy, you can't appreciate those moments. And life's too short, and those moments are gone. So those spots of life, I guess, if someone was making a cheesy movie and you were looking back at all those precious moments you spent with someone, it would be those scenes that you would select for that montage. We should look out for those spots of life and appreciate them before they're gone.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.